Naples, the summer of 1837. The city is sweltering, the air made heavy by the sea and the unrelenting heat, and yet the streets are not filled with life as they once were. They are abandoned, emptied of laughter, emptied of commerce, emptied even of music. Where only weeks before vendors shouted over crates of figs and lemons, there is silence, interrupted only by the occasional wail of mourning. The cholera epidemic has scoured through the districts like fire, burning not buildings but bodies, and leaving suspicion in its wake. In this silence, something strange begins. A barefoot procession, long and winding, gathering itself from the alleyways like smoke. At its head, a group of men carry a veiled statue of the Virgin, draped in cloth as though she herself must be shielded from the eyes of the dying city. Behind them shuffle penitents in torn tunics, chains dragging across stone. They're chanting a low murmur that vibrates through the empty piazzas. The image is startling because of what it represents. In the face of epidemic, the rational voices, doctors, municipal guards, foreign observers had called for quarantine, for clean water, for avoidance of crowds. And yet here is the opposite. Thousands pressed together, desperate, believing salvation lies not in medicine but in motion, not in science but in prayer and the endless act of walking. A priest is heard declaring that the march must not stop until the city is cleansed, until heaven notices their suffering. They walk and the people watch, some joining, others retreating indoors. The contrast is unbearable, a city on the brink of death, and yet life insisting on ritual, on noise, on spectacle. Contemporary accounts, at least the ones that remain, speak of this event as if it was something outside the bounds of time. They walked the long way, one archivist scribbled in a marginal note, but they arrived nowhere. That line, preserved in fading ink on the corner of a parish ledger, is the reason we are telling this story today. Because this is not merely a tale of an epidemic, nor of piety. It is about a collective act, born of desperation, that carried thousands out of Naples into the dark, and never brought them back again. Before we go further, it is important to pause. What follows is drawn from historical fragments, letters, civic reports, censored newspapers, and oral testimony collected in later decades. Some details are dramatized for clarity, but the heart of this story lies in the very real panic that cholera unleashed upon Europe in 1837. It is also a story of fear turning into violence, and of institutions that failed to protect those most vulnerable. Listener discretion is advised. We will describe loss, hysteria, and suppression, though never in gratuitous detail. And as we begin, I would like to invite you into this archive of shadows. Where are you listening from tonight? Do you hear the footsteps on the cobblestones, as clearly as the Neapolitans did that July? If you close your eyes, you may imagine the sight, torchlight flickering against walls stained with lime, a statue hidden beneath cloth, and a long road leading out of the city into the unknown, a procession that walked and walked and walked, yet never returned. If the first images of this story feel heavy, almost unbearable, that is because they are meant to. The summer of 1837 in Naples was unlike any other. The city, usually alive with music and the rhythm of trade, had grown quiet, its people hiding from one another as much as from the disease. And yet, as you listen to this account, I want to draw you into it not as a distant observer, but as a companion at the edge of these deserted streets. Think for a moment, where are you listening from? A crowded train, a dimly lit room, a quiet office where time drags. Wherever you are, you carry with you a perspective the Neapolitans could never have imagined. To them, the world was ending. To us, it is history, reassembled from scraps and silences. This is where your voice matters. Tell me, what city shelters you now? What community surrounds you as you hear this? The contrast between your present and their past is as sharp as light against shadow. Naples then was a capital of vibrancy, a seat of Bourbon power, a place of opera and scholarship, of fishermen's songs and noble palaces. Yet in the space of weeks it became a wasteland of rumor, grief, and suspicion. That is the heart of this narrative. The collapse of the familiar into the unthinkable, and how ordinary people clung to belief, or turned against one another, when faced with something they could not control. Consider the procession again, shuffling through the city. For the participants, it was an act of collective survival, a desperate wager with heaven. For the officials who watched from shuttered palaces, it was disorder, dangerous not only to public health but to political stability. The question was never only about faith or medicine, but about control. Who had the right to guide the people? Who would be blamed if the city fell completely? This tension between the private terror of families, and the cold strategies of authorities will haunt every step of what follows. As you reflect on this, take a moment to think about your own place in the chain of history. If you were in Naples then, would you have joined the march, clutching the hand of your child, hoping the Virgin's veiled face might protect you? Or would you have barred your door, listening to the chants fade into the distance, praying the disease would not find you there? It is an impossible question, but it is one worth holding as we move forward. For now, keep this image in mind. A city silenced by plague, suddenly filled again with voices, footsteps, and torchlight. Not life reborn, but life burning itself out in ritual. The stage is set, the tension between past and present established. And it is on this stage that the first rumors, whispers of poison, whispers of betrayal, will take root, twisting fear into something far darker. Naples in 1837 was a city of contradictions, a place where beauty and decay lived side by side. At dawn, the Gulf shimmered with light, fishermen's boats drifting like flecks of paint across the blue water, while only streets inland the stench of refuse and sickness lingered in the air. The Bourbon monarchy, with its courts, operas, and rituals of ceremony, projected power from the high windows of palaces, but in the cramped alleys of the Quartieri Spagnoli and the slums near Porta Capuana, families slept 10 to a room. Water ran foul and filth piled where children played. The epidemic had not invented suffering. It had only revealed, with brutal clarity, how deep the inequalities of Naples ran. The city was a labyrinth of faith and suspicion. At every corner stood a shrine, painted with fading icons of saints, wax offerings, and rosaries strung like chains of fragile hope. Women lit candles in front of them each morning, whispering prayers that their husbands would return from work alive, that their children's bellies would not tighten with cramps. Yet across the same neighborhoods, doctors appointed by the crown were urging quarantine, the burning of contaminated clothing, the closing of wells. Their words, though, rarely reached the poor. Literacy was scarce, and many believed the doctors were part of the disease itself, spreading it in the name of medicine. The contrast between faith as sanctuary and science as salvation had turned into open conflict, and it was in this soil of mistrust that the procession took root. Official decrees from the Bourbon authorities reveal the panic behind their polished language. Civic order must be preserved, one circular declared, lest the contagion of fear overwhelm the contagion of disease. What the monarchy feared was not only cholera, but rebellion. Naples had long been a restless capital, simmering with liberal ideas and resentment against foreign dynasties. Cholera gave shape to the anger of the poor, and rumors began to spread that the disease was not natural but manufactured, poison poured into fountains, powders sprinkled in the markets, schemes designed to thin the city's population, whether whispered by chance or planted by agitators. Such claims turned suspicion toward those most visible: priests, doctors, even city guards. Every day in the summer of 1837, the toll of the bells marked the dead. In some districts, they rang so often that people stopped counting. Whole families disappeared within days, their doors marked with lime, their possessions carted away to be burned. And yet amid this devastation, hope still flickered, not in the hospitals, which reeked of death and abandonment, but in the rituals that bound the community together. Processions had been part of Naples for centuries, for saints, for victories, for disasters. Now, once more, the people turned to the familiar pattern of gathering, walking, singing, and carrying icons, as if movement itself might outpace death. But the processions of 1837 were different. They were larger, more desperate, and tinged with hysteria. Unlike earlier parades led by priests in bright vestments, these were ragged, with penitents dressed in torn cloth, faces streaked with ash. Children pushed forward to carry candles they could barely hold. People joined not only from devotion but from fear, the logic being that to refuse might mark one as faithless, as an accomplice to the poisoners. In the tension between sanctuary and laboratory, between candlelight and chloroform, between whispered prayer and the clatter of medical instruments, Naples chose faith, or perhaps more truthfully, it had no choice. As dusk fell each evening, the city carried both burdens at once, the moans of the sick echoing in shuttered rooms, and the chants of the faithful echoing in the squares. Those who believed in the doctor's remedies stayed hidden, locking their doors against the sound. Those who believed in miracles joined the marches, convinced that every step was an act of survival, and standing between them were the officials of the crown, watching from a safe distance, unwilling or unable to enforce one course of action. The moral stakes of this story take shape here, in the wide gulf between what could have been done and what was chosen instead. It began quietly, as most contagions of rumor do. A woman from the lower districts, exhausted and parched in the heat, bent to drink from a public fountain near the market square. Witnesses later said she coughed once, then collapsed, her body shuddering with spasms before going still. To the eyes of the doctors, this was another cholera death. Sudden, violent but unsurprising. To the people who watched, however, it was something else. They saw her lips darken too quickly, her skin pale too suddenly. And above all, they saw what clung to the edges of the fountain, a faint, strange powder like dust that had no reason to be there. In a city already soaked with fear, such details became proof. Within hours, the whispers spread. They poisoned the water. The doctors want us gone. The government feeds us death. It was not the first time Naples had heard such accusations. But in the thick of cholera, it took on a sharper edge. Mothers forbade their children from touching public spouts. Families smashed clay jars rather than risk drinking. Even the sight of a stranger leaning too long near a well was enough to spark suspicion. What had been a tragedy woman's collapse, turned into a collective certainty. The disease was not punishment from God, nor the mystery of contagion, but an act of deliberate harm. The contrast between innocence and conspiracy tore the city further apart. Doctors and officials insisted that the fountains were clean, that the cholera spread through invisible means. Miasma, they called it. Foul airs rising from filth and decay. But how could people believe in something they could not see when they had powder in their hands, scraped from stone held up to the sun? Rumor hardened into conviction. In some quarters, men marched door to door, warning neighbors not to trust the wells. They whispered that foreigners had brought the poison, or that royal guards sprinkled the powder at night to thin the poor and protect the rich. Archival fragments preserve the terror. One letter, written by a merchant to his brother in the countryside, reads, "It is no sickness, it is malice. They kill us in silence. Even the water betrays us." The handwriting trembles. The ink smudged where it seems the writer's hand shook. It is not medical evidence, but it is social evidence. Proof of how quickly an entire city could turn its grief into blame. By nightfall, the streets around the fountain were deserted. Torches flickered in doorways, but no one ventured near the square. Soldiers were stationed by the public wells the next morning, their bayonets gleaming in the heat. But their presence only confirmed suspicions. Why guard water unless there was something to hide? The people, once united in ritual, now divided into camps of distrust. Some clung to processions, others to isolation, but nearly all believed that invisible hands were working against them. Thus the first incident crystallized. One collapse at a fountain became a narrative of conspiracy, a seed of paranoia that would grow into violence. And once a community believes that its very sustenance, its water, is poisoned, there is no simple cure for that fear. It was the beginning of a pattern, one that would not stop at rumor. The bells of Naples had always been the city's heartbeat. They tolled for weddings, for feast days, for markets opening at dawn. But in the summer of 1837, their sound had become unbearable. Every strike marked another cholera death, another neighbor lowered into the ground or carried away on a cart. The rhythm was relentless, echoing across narrow streets, already suffocating under the heat and stench of disease. What once called the faithful to prayer now seemed to mock their helplessness. It was in this atmosphere that the second great incident erupted. The bell of a parish near the harbor began tolling at an irregular hour, long before evening prayers. People gathered, first in curiosity, then in dread. Rumor ran ahead of fact. The monks were not merely announcing deaths. They were causing them. "Look at the powder they spread," someone shouted, gesturing toward the cloister's sacristy door. Few swore they had seen robed figures scattering substances near the fountain at dawn. The story was false, but truth mattered little. The sound of the bell fused with the memory of the powder at the well, and suspicion found a target. By dusk, the square was filled with an angry crowd. Men carried torches, women clutched their children, all eyes fixed on the silent facade of the church. A boy threw a stone against the door, the sound splintering through the night. Others followed, and soon the chanting of prayer turned into shouting. The monks within barred the gates, but wooden doors were no match for desperation. The mob surged forward, battering until the sacristy gave way. What they found inside was not poison, but flour, salt, and lime, ordinary stores for cleaning and baking. Yet in that fevered moment, ordinary things looked sinister. Lime became evidence of poisoning, flour mistaken for some deadly powder. A chronicler described the scene in a terrified hand. They overturned the vessels. They scattered white dust into the air as if to prove their own suspicions, coughing and cursing. The bell above continued to toll. Unheeded, the contrast of refuge and betrayal was complete. The church, meant to be sanctuary, had become the stage for accusation. The monks pleaded, tried to explain, but their words were drowned in jeers. Some were dragged into the square and beaten. Others fled through hidden passages into the adjoining streets. The civic guard arrived late, uncertain whether to protect the clergy or appease the crowd. Their hesitation sealed the moment as a failure of authority. No arrests were made. No one was punished. Instead, the image spread across Naples. Monks as poisoners, churches as nests of betrayal. If holy men could not be trusted, what sanctuary remained? The sound of that bell, the toll that started it, lingered in the city's memory. People said it rang differently that night. Not the solemn knell of mourning, but a jagged, broken sound, as though the bell itself had joined the cries of the mob. From then on, every toll carried suspicion. Was it death being announced or death being made? This was the second incident, and it marked a sharp escalation. The first rumor at the fountain had planted doubt. The storming of the sacristy gave that doubt flesh and blood. Naples had crossed from whisper to violence, from suspicion to assault. The disease killed silently, invisibly, but now the people were beginning to kill openly, driven by fear. The procession that would become the city's breaking point began on a Sunday afternoon, when the heat pressed so heavily on Naples that even the gulls circled low and silent above the harbor. From every district, people poured into the streets, barefoot, clutching rosaries, dragging chains. Mothers carried infants swaddled in cloth already stained with sweat, while fathers led their older children by the hand, urging them forward despite their fear. At the center of it all was the veiled statue, borne on a wooden platform by penitents whose shoulders bled under the weight. Torches flared against the pale fabric, casting the Virgin's hidden face into something both tender and ominous. The chant rose not in unison but in fragments, some calling for mercy, others begging for vengeance, all voices trembling with exhaustion. Among the crowd were two families who would later be remembered only for their loss. One was a fisherman's household, the other a washerwoman's. Each had brought children too young to understand the gravity of what was unfolding, but too old to be left behind in shuttered homes. Witnesses later recalled the sight of these children, barefoot, eyes wide, clutching candles almost as tall as themselves. They were placed near the front of the procession, where the priests had told parents the innocent voices would reach heaven most clearly. For a while they walked, their small feet shuffling over cobblestones, their voices breaking into the chant. But as the procession wound its way beyond the heart of the city, pushing into wider streets where shadows pooled and the crowd swelled tighter, the children were lost. Some said they were pulled away by strangers, swept into the mass before their parents could react. Others claimed they simply vanished, as though swallowed by the press of bodies. The truth remains unclear, but when the march finally reached the aqueduct road, the two families searched in vain. Their children were gone. The candles they had carried lay broken on the stones. Panic rippled through the crowd, but fear quickly hardened into accusation. Whispers spread. The children had been taken for sacrifice. The confraternities, some claimed, had promised heaven blood in exchange for deliverance from cholera. The statue, hidden under its veil, was said to demand it. A mother's scream pierced the chanting, her voice carrying above the prayers. "They stole them! They took my babies!" The words infected the march like the disease itself. People clutched their own children tighter, some fleeing back toward the city, others pressing on with grim determination, convinced that leaving the procession was more dangerous than staying. One diary entry, later found among parish records, captures the chaos. "I saw them searching, tearing through the throng, calling names that no one answered, and in their eyes was a terror, greater than the sickness itself, that we had turned upon our own, that our prayers demanded flesh." The handwriting falters there, as if the writer could not bring himself to record more. The disappearance of the children cemented what the earlier incidents had only suggested. The first rumor at the fountain had planted suspicion. The storming of the sacristy had turned suspicion into violence, but the missing children transformed fear into conviction. This was no longer a plague sent by God or spread by invisible air, but a conspiracy rooted within the very rituals meant to save them. Sanctuary had become predation. Innocence was no shield. When the families returned home that night without their children, neighbors met them with pity but also dread. Some whispered that the children had been taken into hidden crypts, others that they had been carried out of the city and abandoned. The truth was never found. What remained was absence, an absence that hung heavier than the sound of the bells, heavier than the odor of death in the streets. Naples was now a city not only of disease but of distrust, where even the march of faith could devour its most vulnerable. In the aftermath of the vanished children, a few figures within Naples attempted to bring order to the chaos, though their voices were frail against the roar of rumor. Among them was Dr. Giacomo Veroni, an alienist, what we might now call a psychiatrist, attached to the city's civic hospital. Veroni was no politician, nor a man of the pulpit. He saw himself as a chronicler of minds, and he began to keep a careful ledger of what he observed during those weeks when the city seemed to unravel. His notebook survives only in fragments, water-stained and blotched with ink, but what remains is chilling in its attempt to make sense of the senseless. Mass fear is an infection, he wrote on July 22nd, the day after the Great Procession. Its symptoms mimic disease, pallor, trembling, exhaustion, delirium. But unlike cholera, it spreads by sight and sound alone. One cry in the street, one gesture misunderstood, and 100 will fall ill with terror. Veroni saw the city as if it were a patient, its body convulsing, its mind fevered. He noted how mothers clutched children tighter after the disappearances, how men walked armed with knives to fetch water, how neighbors no longer greeted one another at the threshold. Trust itself, he believed, was dissolving faster than the bodies of the dead. His ledger does not mock the faithful, though. In another entry he admitted, "The chants and marches are a kind of medicine for the people, though a dangerous one. It binds them together in hope, yet binds them also in suspicion. When hope fails, the bond turns cruel." He seemed to understand that the processions were not only ritual but survival, an attempt to give shape to despair. Yet he feared where that survival instinct might lead. Among the most haunting passages is a sketch, a crude drawing of the veiled statue carried at the head of the march. Beneath it he scribbled, "The face unseen becomes the face imagined." The veil is the canvas for their terror. Here, Veroni touched on something profound. The unseen, the unknown, became the space where people painted their fears. To him, the missing children were not only a tragedy, but a symptom, a visible eruption of an invisible illness of belief. The contrast between reason and mania could not be sharper. While Veroni catalogued symptoms and patterns, the city outside his study room windows was tearing itself apart. When he tried to share his notes with civic officials, they waved him off. What use was analysis when bodies were piling in courtyards, when mobs demanded answers now? One official scrawled in the margin of his petition, "This man writes as if the people were animals to be studied. He does not see they are citizens to be controlled." But Veroni saw what they refused to acknowledge. Hysteria was not separate from cholera, it was its twin. To treat one without the other was to lose both battles. An especially poignant artifact is preserved, a single loose sheet where Veroni recorded a testimony from a grieving mother. She screamed that her children had been offered up. She would not drink water, nor eat bread, convinced all was poisoned. She begged me to bleed her, to purge the poison she imagined in her veins. I could do nothing. She died 2 days later, not of cholera, but of despair. The alienist's words tremble at the edges, ink feathering where the quill pressed too hard. It is both science and lament. Veroni's ledger would later vanish into Bourbon archives, buried under bureaucratic reports of civil unrest and unfounded panic. Yet, what remains shows a man trying to map the psychology of a city collapsing. To him, the plague was not only bacterial but mental, a shadow epidemic eating away at judgment, patience, and compassion. His quiet voice, preserved in ink, was a plea for understanding in a time when few wanted to hear. The church in Naples, caught between its role as comforter and its reputation as conspirator, found itself paralyzed. Parish priests were torn, some urging their flocks to gather in prayer, others begging them to remain indoors lest the disease and the mobs alike consume them. In this confusion, a single voice rises from the archive with startling clarity, that of Deacon Antonio Rinaldi, a minor cleric in one of the parishes closest to the aqueduct road. His letter, preserved only because it was later seized and filed among state correspondence, is one of the rare first-hand accounts that describes the aftermath of the great procession as it unfolded. Written in cramped Latin, with hurried crossings out and ink blots that suggest trembling hands, Rinaldi's words carry both fear and resignation. The march walks still, he begins, but it does not halt, nor does it return. It is a river of bodies flowing outward. No mass is celebrated. No prayers are concluded. They walk, and when I ask whither, no one answers. His description reads less like theology than a nightmare. A procession that has broken free of its own purpose, a ritual that no longer serves God, but has become something self-consuming. Rinaldi pleads with his archbishop for guidance. Shall I forbid them? They would tear me limb from limb. Shall I bless them? Then I bless their destruction. I see mothers beating their breasts, fathers dragging children too weary to walk, youth singing hymns that dissolve into shrieks. This is not devotion but delirium. The contrast he captures, piety against futility, devotion against madness, is almost unbearable. Here is a man whose calling was to shepherd souls, reduced to the role of a horrified spectator, watching his flock march into nothingness. The letter contains details that later fed the darker rumors. He mentions confraternity leaders who seemed to push the crowd onward, discouraging rest, whispering of a final cleansing that lay ahead. He notes that some families begged to return home but were urged to keep moving, told that to leave was to betray the Virgin. I fear, he writes, that the holy image is now their jailer, not their protector. That line alone secured the letters. Place in the archive, though it was later marked with the word suppressus in the margin, a sign it was never meant for public eyes. One chilling fragment occurs near the end. I counted the hours until dawn. Still they had not returned. Still the chanting continued beyond the city's edge, a sound like waves breaking but never ceasing. I thought of the Israelites wandering in the desert. Yet even they had Moses. My people have no one. They follow emptiness, and emptiness answers. This confession, more poetic than clerical, suggests Rinaldi knew he was documenting something unprecedented. Artifacts such as this letter matter because they give structure to what might otherwise be dismissed as folklore. Without it, the story of a procession that never returned might remain a rumor whispered in taverns. But here, in the shaky hand of a deacon, the evidence is set down. The march was real. The strangeness witnessed, the futility acknowledged. It does not prove what happened to those who vanished, but it proves that they did vanish, that the road out of Naples swallowed them in some fashion no institution dared to explain. The contrast is clear. On one side, the faithful clinging to ritual as their last defense. On the other, a cleric too rational, too frightened, to sanctify what he saw. His appeal for instruction received no recorded reply. The Archbishop's archive shows no letter back, no order issued, only silence. The institutional church, like the Crown, preferred to avert its gaze rather than confront what could not be controlled. And so the letter stands as a solitary voice in the wilderness, bearing witness to a march without end. In his final line, Rinaldi writes, "If they come back, I will know how to speak. If they do not, I will hold my tongue." History tells us he kept his word. Inside the Bourbon administrative palace, only a few streets removed from the stinking alleys where cholera thrived, the atmosphere was no less fevered. Officials paced marbled corridors, their voices hushed but their tempers sharp. They were not only afraid of the disease, many of them had already retreated to country estates, but of the people themselves. The rumor of poisoned wells and the storming of the sacristy had made clear how quickly panic could turn into riot. Now, with thousands vanishing into processions that defied reason, the question pressed on them with suffocating urgency. Should the Crown intervene, or should it look away? Dr. Giacomo Verona, the alienist whose ledger recorded the psychological unraveling of the city, was summoned to one such council. He arrived still carrying his notes, pages crowded with observations of hysteria and despair. To him, the answer was plain. Halt the processions, disperse the crowds, and restore the population's trust through clear, decisive action. He warned that to allow the marches to continue, unchecked, was to risk not only more deaths by contagion, but a collapse of civic authority. We treat the body with quarantine, he argued. But what of the mind that festers in rumor? This contagion will not burn out. It will consume us. His words, preserved in a colleague's private diary, fell heavily in the chamber, yet no one reached for pen or seal to enact them. The dilemma lay naked on the table. If they banned the procession outright, they risked a riot in the streets, the sight of guards turning their weapons against mothers and children. The monarchy, already mistrusted, would be accused of blasphemy and tyranny. Yet if they allowed it to continue, the city bled its people outward, into roads from which they did not return, leaving Naples hollowed and humiliated. It was the contrast between help and harm, between decisive action that might ignite revolt and inaction that guaranteed decay. One official, a commissioner for public order, proposed a compromise to permit the procession but surround it with guards, shepherding it back before it strayed too far. But even this half measure was rejected. "The crowd does not trust us," another replied, "and if we enter their midst, they will turn on us. Better they walk themselves to exhaustion than they tear us to pieces." Barone listened in disbelief, scratching furiously in the margins of his ledger. Later he would write, "Their fear of the people outweighed their duty to the people. They saw citizens not as souls to preserve, but as a mob to avoid." The meeting ended without decree. The archbishop issued no proclamation, the crown no command. The city, abandoned by those meant to govern it, remained suspended in a paralysis more deadly than any powder in a well. The processions would continue, untethered, directionless, as officials sat in marble halls debating their own survival. Varone, leaving the chamber, reportedly muttered to a clerk, "They have chosen silence. Silence will kill more than cholera." In this silence a vacuum opened. Where authority would not act, rumor acted instead. Where officials hesitated, confraternities moved boldly. And where science and law faltered, desperation found its own brutal remedies. The stage was set for the next escalation. Not by the will of rulers, but by the absence of it. Naples was a city without command, walking itself into oblivion. There comes a point in every account where the past presses too hard against the present, where the listener must be allowed to breathe. This is such a point. We have walked with Naples through the fever of rumor, the fury of mobs, the silence of vanished children. Before the story advances further into disappearance and confrontation, it is worth pausing just for a moment to consider what it means both then and now. Imagine yourself among them. You hear the toll of bells that once meant celebration but now announce only death. You see neighbors you have known all your life, gaunt and frantic, clutching candles, marching behind a veiled statue they believe will carry their petitions to heaven. You are told by one voice that faith alone will save you, and by another that only quarantine and isolation can give you a chance. Which would you choose? Would you trust the invisible theories of science in an age when germs had not yet been named? Or would you throw your body into the current of the crowd, praying that collective devotion might shield you? This tension, the pull between belief and reason, between ritual and medicine, is not confined to the 19th century. It lingers in every society that has faced calamity. When fear surges, people reach for what feels familiar, what gives meaning, even if it offers no cure. For the people of Naples, the procession was both survival strategy and trap, a comfort that carried them deeper into danger. And for us looking back, the question becomes uncomfortably personal. Would we have chosen differently? I want to ask you directly as you listen. In the face of uncertainty, where do you place your trust? Do you place it in what you can measure or in what you can believe? If you lived in a city where the air reeked of death and children, disappeared into crowds, would you stay behind locked doors with your doubts? Or would you take your place in the torchlit march, clutching a rosary in the dark? This is an optional moment of reflection, a place for you to share your thoughts if you wish. Where are you listening from tonight? And what would you have done in their place? Leave a comment, not for me, but for others who gather here, as if around a virtual shrine, to think about the choices of history. Because soon, we must return to the road, the very road that stretched out of Naples into shadow. Soon we will follow the torches as they vanish beyond the aqueduct, and listen to the silence that follows. And when we do, it will not be with the safety of hindsight alone, but with the unease of realizing how fragile our own choices might be under the weight of fear. Night descended heavy upon Naples, and with it came a silence broken only by the shuffle of thousands of feet upon stone. The great procession, swollen by those who had joined throughout the day, gathered beneath the arches of the aqueduct road. Torches sputtered in the damp evening air, their lights staining the faces of men and women already hollowed by hunger and grief. Some held banners depicting the Virgin. Others dragged wooden crosses, the splinters tearing their palms. From a distance it might have seemed a solemn act of worship. Up close it carried the dissonant tone of delirium, of voices raised in hymns that slipped into sobbing wails. Among the surviving fragments of evidence is the diary of a young notary's apprentice, Matteo Serra, who followed the crowd at his master's command to record what transpired. His words are uneven, sometimes clinical, sometimes frantic, but they give us a window into that evening. The torches numbered too many to count. They marched beyond Porta Capuana, out into the country. I heard a sound like the sea, not of water but of chanting and coughing together. When I asked where they went, none would answer, only point forward, as if the destination lay in the dark itself. Sarah wrote that the crowd's pace never slackened, as though driven by something unseen, though children stumbled, and the elderly collapsed by the roadside. Those who fell were not lifted. The crowd stepped over them, eyes fixed ahead. The contrast is startling. Outwardly a procession of piety, but within it, the harsh indifference of survival. What began as devotion had hardened into compulsion. Sarah describes the unsettling rhythm. They walk, they sing, they fall, and still they walk. To him it felt less like worship than like a fever dream, where bodies obeyed, a law that no one could name. Another artifact, a police memorandum from that same night, confirms his account. The officer notes how watchmen stationed near the city gates heard chanting continue long after midnight, drifting back on the wind from the fields. They lit lanterns and tried to follow, but soon turned back, unnerved by the scale of the crowd and the wilderness of the country lanes. In their report, they chose a neutral phrase. The procession has extended beyond jurisdiction. It is a line that speaks volumes, law yielding to mystery, authority retreating before the unknown. Witnesses who lived along the road remembered, their windows rattling as the multitude passed. Some swearing they heard chains among the hymns, others recalling the scent of sickness carried like smoke. For those who stayed indoors, the march became a phantom presence, audible but unseen, an endless sound moving outward into the dark. And then, after hours, silence. No triumphant return at dawn, no trickle of weary pilgrims back into the city. The road that had carried them outward did not bring them home. It is here that the story shifts from observable fact into disquieting uncertainty. Diaries, letters, and reports converge on one truth. Thousands left Naples that night, and their reappearance was never formally recorded. What became of them was left to rumor, speculation, or suppression. Some said they walked until they fell in ditches, their bodies carted off by peasants unwilling to speak. Others whispered they entered caves beneath the countryside, drawn by promises of miraculous water. A few insisted the earth itself opened, swallowing them whole. Yet the artifacts, the diary of Sarah, the memorandum of the police, remain, lending the horror its weight. We know they walked. We know they did not return. Between those facts lies the abyss into which Naples stared, an abyss from which its rulers recoiled. The days that followed the procession's disappearance were filled with a silence heavier than any funeral bell. Families waited at thresholds for the return of their loved ones. Priests hesitated to speak from the pulpit, not knowing whether to promise hope or admit loss. It was not until the third day that the city dared to act. A group of civic guards, pressed into service by a magistrate unwilling to risk his own reputation, rode out along the aqueduct road to search for survivors. Their mission was hastily ordered. Their instructions vague: find evidence of the marchers, determine whether they had dispersed or perished, and report back without inflaming public panic. The guard captain's report, preserved in the municipal archive, is both restrained and unnerving. At 2 miles from Porta Capuana we found the first remains of candles, melted to pools of wax upon the stones. At 3 miles, scattered shoes, a child's doll broken of one arm. At 4 miles, garments torn and thrown in the dust, as though abandoned in haste or stripped by hand. The fields were trampled, the hedges broken. We saw signs of great multitude, but encountered no souls living. His description turns clinical, almost desperate to avoid implication. Yet the artifacts themselves, a doll, shoes, garments, were collected and listed in an inventory, each marked with a number as though numbers could explain absence. The deeper they rode, the stranger the signs became. The guards noted crude symbols daubed in white chalk on stones along the roadside. Crosses bent sideways, circles enclosing stars, images no one claimed ownership of. One guard swore he heard chanting in the distance, But when they followed, they found only a dry cistern, its walls scratched with the names of saints and pleas for mercy. Another found bones in the ditch, animal, most likely, but gnawed clean and arrayed in a ring, as if part of a ritual. The captain recorded none of these claims formally, but the marginal notes in his ledger suggest his men returned unnerved, muttering of madness. Contrast here grows stark. The searchers expected bodies, evidence of epidemic death, something rational if grim. What they found instead was absence where presence should be, traces without conclusion, artifacts without explanation. Faithful objects like rosaries lay broken beside symbols no church would sanction. It was as if the procession had passed through a veil between piety and delirium, leaving only fragments for the living to puzzle over. One particularly disturbing artifact survives, a letter found in the dirt, unsigned but addressed to Dearest Mother. Its ink was blurred, but enough remained legible. Do not come after us. They say the road leads to the place of cleansing. If we are worthy, we will not need to return. If we are not, you will not wish to see us. Again, the letter was filed under miscellaneous, then buried in bureaucratic obscurity until rediscovered generations later. Its phrasing suggests the marchers believed themselves chosen for some transformation, not a pilgrimage, but an ordeal. The guards, after riding as far as the 5th milestone, turned back. Their report closes abruptly. The road beyond shows the same signs. We cannot continue without reinforcement. No reinforcement ever came. No second expedition was sent. The Crown, the Church, and the municipal authorities chose silence once more, sealing the matter under layers of neglect. The file was stamped Archivio Chiuso, closed archive. For the families left waiting in Naples, this closure was unbearable. Mothers demanded answers. Brothers pleaded with priests. Fathers roamed the countryside themselves, searching in vain. Nothing returned to them but rumors, artifacts, and silence. It is here that the legend hardened, fed not by invention but by the very refusal of those in power to seek truth. The silence, however carefully maintained by magistrates and prelates, could not hold forever. Into that void came a survivor, though calling. Him such might stretch the word beyond comfort. His name appears in scattered records as Domenico Altamura, a stonemason's apprentice from the district of Forcella. Some accounts say he staggered back into Naples a week after the Great Procession, half-starved and incoherent. Others insist he was discovered by peasants on the outskirts, lying in a ditch, raving in fragments of prayer and nonsense. Wherever he was first found, all agree he bore the mark of having walked far and seen too much. The first testimony attributed to him survives in the interrogation, notes of a civic physician, preserved in the hospital archives. The handwriting of the examiner is brisk, unsympathetic, as though he considered Domenico less a witness than a curiosity. Subject claims to have accompanied the procession beyond the 5th milestone. The report begins, but insists the marchers did not stop. When pressed for destination, replies only, the cleansing, the cleansing. He trembles when asked about companions, repeating the names of saints as though reciting a litany. The physician judged him delusional, perhaps unbalanced before the march even began. Yet beneath the scorn, a few fragments catch the eye. Domenico spoke of torches that never guttered, of a chant that seemed to swell without source, and of a road that lengthened impossibly as they walked. We went on, he murmured, but the towns we knew did not appear. The stars themselves shifted. When asked what became of the others, he fell silent, then whispered, They walked ahead. I could not keep pace. I fell behind. The sound of their voices grew thin, and then nothing. There are other darker fragments, recorded not in the physician's notes, but in a priest's private diary. Father Lorenzo, who tended Domenico briefly in a parish infirmary, wrote that the young man wept whenever he heard church bells. He begged me to silence them, saying they were not bells but chains. He described faces that no longer looked human, twisted by hunger and ecstasy, yet still singing hymns. He warned that to follow them was to walk into a pit from which no prayer could recall you. These words were never entered into official record. They remained hidden in a diary until scholars uncovered them centuries later. The contrast is brutal. On one side, a living voice returned from the march begging to be heard. On the other, institutions determined to dismiss or suppress his account, lest it inflame fear further. Domenico's testimony, fractured as it was, became a kind of forbidden scripture. Some called him a madman, others a prophet. Mothers whispered his name when they prayed for missing children. torn between hope that he might reveal their fate and dread that his fate was warning enough. One artifact tied to his story is especially haunting, a scrap of cloth he carried, embroidered with a crude image of the Virgin, stained dark at its edges. In the margin of the physician's notes appears a line, "Object confiscated, stored with other curiosities. Its current whereabouts are unknown." Was it a relic passed among marchers? A talisman of their purpose? Or merely the keepsake of a frightened youth? Its disappearance echoes the broader fate of the procession itself. Objects vanish as surely as people, leaving only questions behind. Domenico did not live long. Some records say he succumbed to fever. Others claim he fled Naples altogether, unable to endure the bells and the stairs. What remains of him is testimony, fragmented, inconsistent, but impossible to ignore. His was the first living voice to suggest that the march did not end in a destination but in an unraveling, a journey into emptiness that consumed its participants. Dr. Giacomo Verone, already isolated within the Bourbon administration, for his insistence that the mind itself was unraveling under cholera's pressure, seized on the testimony of Domenico Altamura as both vindication and warning. In his private ledger, kept in tight, slanting script, he copied passages from the physician's notes and the priest's diary, annotating them with his own conclusions. To Verone, Domenico was not a madman whose words could be dismissed. He was living evidence of what happens when rumor and ritual fuse into a contagion of the mind. Here, Verone wrote, "We see hysteria distilled, a body compelled beyond exhaustion, a crowd compelled beyond sense. This is epidemic of spirit, no less deadly than epidemic of flesh." He described the procession as a form of collective madness, a phenomenon observed in convents and schools, but never before on such a scale. He compared it to the tarantism of southern Italy, where dancers convulsed for days, believing themselves bitten by a spider. Only this, he argued, was worse. Not dance, but disappearance. Not ecstasy, but erasure. The contrast he drew was stark. Where the public still insisted the marchers were martyrs or victims of poison, Verone insisted they were victims of suggestion, swallowed by the very faith meant to preserve them. "The Virgin has become their disease," he wrote coldly. Such words were unprintable in Naples, where devotion to Mary was woven into the city's identity. To accuse the cult of the Madonna of sanità of fueling madness was to risk not only censure but mob violence. Verone knew this, yet his conviction sharpened. If we do not treat the mind, no quarantine will suffice. The people will march themselves into death even as their bodies remain untouched by cholera. He tried to persuade officials once more, presenting Domenico's case as proof. The council chamber where he spoke was filled with uneasy men, magistrates, clerics, minor nobles. Verone read aloud fragments of the youth's testimony, the cleansing, the road without end, the faces not human then, argued that such hallucinations were not signs of divine mystery but of fevered brains, in a city suffocating under grief and rumor. He urged them to establish public demonstrations of reason, to show clean wells, to burn false relics, to forbid processions. He went so far as to recommend asylum-like quarters for those exhibiting the compulsion to march. The reaction was chillingly uniform, silence, then rejection. A magistrate cleared his throat and said, "Doctor, if we tell the people their faith is madness, they will stone us in the streets. If we call them delirious, they will hang you on the nearest lamppost. Your science is a luxury Naples cannot afford." A cleric muttered that Domenico's visions might well be demonic, not medical, and therefore outside Verone's purview. His words were noted but not acted upon. Here lies another contrast between knowledge and power. Verone possessed the insight, but not the authority. The crown preferred superstition over science, because superstition could be managed by silence, whereas science demanded confrontation. And so his warnings, though preserved in his ledger, fell into the same void that swallowed the marchers. In one bitter entry, dated December 1837, Verone reflected on his failure. They will not listen. They prefer to bury truth with the bodies. The people vanish. The officials vanish behind their walls. Only the sound of feet remains. Perhaps I am mad also, for still I hear it. His words read not only as diagnosis, but as confession, as though he too was haunted by the compulsion he sought to explain. By the winter of 1837, Naples had become a city not only haunted by disease and disappearance, but by whispers of betrayal. Where the alienist Verone spoke of hysteria, the common people, and increasingly, The newspapers smuggled in from abroad spoke of plots. The empty road beyond the aqueduct was no longer only a mystery of faith. It was said to be a highway of treachery, engineered by unseen hands. The first accusation fell predictably upon foreigners. Some claimed the English, jealous of Bourbon control over Mediterranean trade, had sown panic by spreading rumors of poisoned wells. Others named the Austrians, eager to weaken Naples so their soldiers might march in unopposed. Still others pointed to the French, forever accused of carrying revolution in their blood. In taverns the story hardened. The processions had not vanished into thin air, but had been intercepted, captured, even sold into slavery overseas. "Better cholera than chains," muttered one sailor, recorded in a pamphlet later confiscated by the police. Yet not all suspicion was cast beyond Naples. A darker rumor accused the crown itself. According to this version, the king's ministers allowed the processions to march deliberately, knowing they would never return, in order to thin the desperate poor who crowded the alleys. One broadsheet, distributed in secret and seized within hours, bore the headline, "The long walk to nowhere was a walk to death ordered by the palace." No author was named, but the phrasing mirrored the radical press of northern Italy, fueling suspicions of conspiracy. In contrast to Veroni's cold medical rationalism, these conspiracies offered something far more emotionally satisfying. A villain, an explanation that could be hated. To call the marchers victims of suggestion was to rob them of dignity. To call them victims of a plot was to elevate them into martyrs of injustice. The people, already primed by rage against supposed poisoners, found this new narrative easier to grasp than the murmurings of an alienist. Artifacts reinforced this shift. A coded note found in the possession of a dock worker, preserved in police files, contained only 3 words repeated: Posi, Stranieri Procession, Wells, Foreigners Procession. Another file records a crude drawing of a crowned head with a dagger thrust through its throat, confiscated from the wall of a wine cellar. Both speak to a growing conviction that the disappearance was not an accident of faith, nor an epidemic of the mind, but a crime of power. The authorities responded as they always had, with silence and suppression. But silence now worked against them. To suppress the alienists' theory was simple. To suppress rage against the palace was impossible. Naples, once paralyzed by uncertainty, began to seethe with dangerous clarity. Someone had made the procession vanish, and someone must be made to pay. This shift marks the story's next turn, from mystery into confrontation, from absence into accusation. In the space between hysteria and conspiracy, Naples teetered on the edge of revolt. And in that charged air, the memory of the vanished marchers became something new. Not only a wound, but a weapon. By early January 1838, the tension that had simmered in Naples boiled over into confrontation. The city's alleys and markets were alive with accusation, each rumor sharpened into a blade. Mothers who had lost their sons in the march no longer prayed quietly. At the chapel steps, they stormed parish doors, demanding that priests reveal what they knew. Dock workers and artisans, emboldened by cheap pamphlets and whispered oaths, began to gather in clusters after dusk, their voices swelling into chants that mingled grief with fury. It was in this climate that the first direct clash occurred. The confraternity of Sanità, whose veiled Madonna had led the vanished procession, became the target. On a frigid morning, a crowd surged against their chapel. Witnesses later testified that candles were ripped from altars, banners torn, and statues pelted with stones. A priest attempted to calm them, insisting the marchers had chosen to follow God's will. He was struck to the ground, and though spared death by the intervention of older parishioners, he crawled away bloodied. The chapel's wooden doors, meant to open onto worship, were barred from within for the first time in living memory. The sacred had become suspect. At the same time, pressure mounted against the civic authorities. The municipal palace, long aloof from the misery outside, now found its steps crowded with petitioners bearing relics of the vanished: shoes, handkerchiefs, broken rosaries. These they thrust into the faces of guards, demanding explanation. If they were poisoned, prove it. If they were stolen, find them. If they are dead, bury them, one widow is recorded as shouting, her words scrawled in the margin of a policeman's report. The contrast was unbearable. Ordinary people brandishing tokens of absence before stone-faced officials who could offer nothing but silence. In that vacuum, rumor became weaponized. Radical pamphlets declared the procession a state crime, while conservative clerics muttered of satanic infiltration. Both sides inflamed the crowd. At night, torches appeared outside the archbishop's residence. They did not break in, but the message was clear. Patience was gone. One guard reported hearing chants of traditore, traitor, traitor, the institution meant to anchor. Naples in faith had itself become a suspect vessel of betrayal. Dr. Veroni watched from the margins. His ledger records a scene at the palace gates where a grieving father held up a scrap of cloth, the same kind that Domenico Altamura had carried, screaming, "You made them walk."
"You let them vanish,"
Veroni wrote. I saw the sickness of mind now turned against authority. Not hallucination, but rage. Yet rage is no less consuming. For him, the confrontation confirmed his theory. Once the mind succumbs to contagion, it seeks an enemy to blame. What began as inward collapse had now burst outward into violence. The city trembled on the edge of riot. Guards doubled their watch. Clergy hid valuables. Officials wrote frantic letters to the crown begging for soldiers. Yet even as they prepared for defense, they dared not name the truth. To acknowledge the vanished procession was to confess failure. To deny it was to stoke fury. And so they hovered between lies and silence. While Naples itself demanded blood or answers, this was the breaking point. The moment when the mystery of the march ceased to be private grief and became public crisis. Naples was no longer merely a city haunted by disappearance. It was a city confronting its own institutions, demanding to know whether the procession's long walk had been into heaven, into hell, or into the jaws of a power that had betrayed them. The rupture came swiftly, as though the city had held its breath too long and could no longer restrain itself. By late January, Naples was a tinderbox. The confrontation at the confraternity's chapel and the unrest outside the archbishop's residence had emboldened the restless, while silence from crown and clergy hardened suspicion into certainty. And so one night, a crowd of several hundred surged toward the offices of the Congregazione della Sanità, the civic body tasked with managing public health. The mob was not armed like soldiers, but with desperation sharpened into fury. They carried iron tools from workshops, wooden staves torn from carts, and torches that dripped sparks onto the cobblestones. Their cry was not of prayer, but indictment. Show us the lists. Show us the names. For weeks, rumors had spread that the health congregation maintained secret registers of those taken or lost, that the vanished procession was no mystery, but a record locked behind wooden doors. The guards posted outside, low-paid and fearful, tried to bar the entrance, but were overwhelmed. A wave of bodies pressed in, breaking shutters, overturning benches. By candlelight, the intruders rifled through chests and cupboards. What they found was no single damning ledger, but fragments, scraps of correspondence, unfinished reports, notes hastily marked riservato, restricted. These were seized like holy relics, waved above the crowd as proof that betrayal had been hidden in plain sight. One document, later copied into a clandestine pamphlet, bore the heading Registro Straordinario dei Processioni Extraordinari, Register of the Processions. Its content was thin, nothing more than a list of dates with tally marks beside them. But to the eyes of the enraged, it was undeniable confirmation. They counted us like cattle, one woman shouted, as the paper passed from hand to hand. Another voice claimed the missing. Tally marks represented those who had been sold, or buried, or spirited away. In the chaos, the paper tore, each fragment carried off like a scrap of scripture. Contrast is vivid here. To officials, these registers were bureaucratic clutter, half-finished files abandoned in fear of scandal. To the people, they were proof incarnate, evidence of conspiracy sanctified by secrecy. The very absence of explanation gave the papers their power. What was not written spoke louder than what was. Dr. Veroni, summoned to the scene after order was restored, described what he saw in his ledger. The mob entered not for bread, nor for coin, but for knowledge. They sought truth as if it were gold, and when they found only fragments, they minted them into certainty. The contagion of belief is now total. His words carry both clinical detachment and despair. He knew that once documents were seized and interpreted through rage, no rational correction could undo their force. The Crown responded with predictable violence. Soldiers were deployed to secure the health congregation building, and several rioters were arrested. Yet even in prison cells, the fragments of seized documents circulated, copied by sympathetic scribes, retold in taverns and whispered in workshops. The state's effort to suppress the truth only confirmed it in the eyes of the people. Naples had crossed a threshold. The vanished procession was no longer a mystery to mourn, but a scandal to avenge. And in this climate, one name began to surface more than others, that of Archbishop Vincenzo Riario, accused of concealing correspondence with the confraternity and colluding with civic officials to sacrifice the poor. Whether true or not, the accusation would become the fulcrum of the city's next act of defiance. By the first week of February, the fury of Naples turned from civic offices toward the church itself. If the vanished could not be explained by the health congregation's fragments, then surely their fate lay within the vaults of the archbishop. Rumors thickened like smoke that the archbishop's residence housed letters to Rome describing the experiment of the procession, that priests had recorded the names of those taken, intending to erase them from the rolls of the living, that chalices melted from confiscated rings and trinkets of the vanished now adorned secret altars. On a damp evening, when the streets smelled of wet stone and mildew, the crowd gathered outside the episcopal palace. This was no ragged mob now, but a cross-section of Naples itself, widows clutching rosaries, dock workers with scarred hands, shopkeepers who had shuttered their stalls, apprentices carrying torches. Their chant was a single word, repeated until it echoed against the palace facade. Lettere, lettere, the letters. They demanded correspondence, documents, evidence. They no longer asked for miracle or mass. They demanded paper, ink, proof. The guards outside were more resolute than those at the health congregation, but numbers overwhelmed discipline. A side door was forced, shutters splintered, and the crowd poured in. Unlike the looting of taverns or markets, this invasion did not seek food or coin. They moved room to room like investigators, overturning drawers, rifling through cabinets, slashing open trunks. Sacred vestments were tossed aside, paintings torn from walls, not for their gold leaf but for the hope of hidden pockets. The palace, once a sanctuary, became a desecrated archive. What they found fed their fire. In the archbishop's study, a locked coffer was dragged into the courtyard and pried open with iron bars. Inside were bundles of letters sealed in red wax, many addressed to and from clergy in Rome. Fragments survive in later testimonies, though none were ever publicly authenticated. One, dated December 1837, read, "The procession has gone beyond control. Their numbers swell daily, and yet their minds do not return whole. If their bodies falter, let them be counted among the offering. To resist would endanger more than to permit." Another, unsigned but scrawled in Latin, carried an even darker suggestion. "It is better that a multitude perish in the shadow than that the light of faith be extinguished. Let silence be our guard, for the people cannot endure truth." These words, real or forged, ignited outrage. To the crowd, they were nothing less than confession that the church had knowingly sacrificed its flock, that faith had been used as veil for slaughter. The palace burned with fury but not with fire. Torches were raised but not set to timber. Instead, the documents themselves became flame. Pages were fed to torches, their embers carried into the street where they rained down like sparks. Children caught fragments in the air and shouted their words to the crowd, each line twisted into indictment. It did not matter what the letters truly said. The act of tearing them from the archbishop's coffer was proof enough that betrayal had been hidden. In his ledger, Dr. Veroni recorded what he witnessed from a window across the square. Tonight, the people opened the veins of authority. They drain not blood but words, and words may wound deeper than blades. I fear the malady is complete. They will see conspiracy in every silence, guilt in every delay, damnation in every clerical robe. His observation captures the essence of that. Night, faith overturned, authority stripped, belief inverted into rage. The archbishop himself was not harmed. He was smuggled out by loyal clerics under cover of darkness, fleeing toward a villa beyond the city. But his absence only inflamed suspicion further. To the people, his flight was an admission of guilt, a silent acknowledgement that he had overseen the vanishing and could not bear to face them. What Naples had once called sacred processions were now mocked in Whispers as il Camino de Morti, the walk of the dead. And with ecclesiastical power shaken, the city slid closer toward collapse. The next step would no longer be papers and protests. It would be violence, soldiers, and the thin edge between riot and revolution. By mid-February, Naples had become a city under siege, not from an outside enemy, but from itself. The palace raid had scattered sacred letters into the hands of the people. their fragments retold with each passing day until rumor hardened into certainty. To the streets, it was no longer a question of whether the authorities had betrayed them, but of how deeply the betrayal ran. Every silence was interpreted as concealment, every clerical vestment as a disguise for guilt. Against this fever of suspicion, the Crown acted in the only language it still trusted: force. On the morning of February 16th, soldiers marched into the Sanità quarter, where the first and largest procession had begun. Drums beat a martial rhythm against narrow walls, the sound intended to announce discipline, but echoing instead like a funeral march. Their orders were clear: suppress the gatherings, restore calm, and seize any further documents or blasphemous pamphlets circulating about the vanished. They carried muskets, bayonets fixed, their polished boots trampling. The very cobblestones were barefoot. Children had once followed the Madonna's statue. The residents were waiting. Word had spread in the night that the troops were coming. Barricades of overturned carts and furniture blocked the alleys. Housewives emptied pots of boiling water from upper windows. Apprentices armed themselves with cobblers' knives and hammers, and children hurled stones from rooftops. The soldiers pushed forward, firing warning shots that cracked against shutters, but the crowd did not disperse. Their grief had transmuted into defiance, their fear into rage. At the heart of the confrontation stood a makeshift altar, dragged into the street. Upon it lay torn fragments of the Archbishop's letters, pinned with nails to a plank of wood. Around it, the people knelt and chanted prayers twisted into curses. If we are to perish, let them perish with us. The altar was both sanctuary and barricade, a symbol of what they had lost and what they refused to surrender. The clash was inevitable. A soldier, struck by a stone, raised his musket and fired into the crowd. The shot felled a young man, an apprentice blacksmith named Raffaele D'Amato. His body collapsed against the altar, blood soaking the fragments of parchment. The sight ignited the quarter into fury. Bells rang from nearby churches, not for mass, but as a call to arms. Men surged against the soldiers, grappling at bayonets, pulling muskets from their hands. Witnesses later claimed that for several hours, the Sanità quarter became a battlefield. Smoke from muskets and torches filled the air, mingling with the smell of iron and sweat. Drums were silenced by the roar of voices. One diary, smuggled from the scene, recorded, "The city no longer marches with statues. It marches with its own dead." The irony was bitter. What had begun as a holy procession now ended in a secular uprising. Bodies carried not behind veiled Madonnas, but on makeshift biers toward hastily dug graves. Dr. Verone, observing from a side street, wrote the longest single entry of his ledger. Here the contagion completed its course. Faith had turned to despair, despair to suspicion, suspicion to violence. And now violence breeds death, and death breeds further contagion. The procession that once promised salvation has reached its final station. Civil war in miniature. He described children shouting curses at soldiers, mothers tearing their hair at the sight of fallen sons, soldiers themselves staggering back in disbelief at the fury they had unleashed. By dusk, the Crown's forces had retaken the quarter, but at a cost. Dozens lay dead, more wounded, and the air was thick with ash from burning barricades. No one could agree on the numbers, and official records were sealed almost immediately, their pages marked with the chilling phrase non divulgare, not to be disclosed. But in taverns and workshops, the truth was whispered. Naples had killed its own to silence the questions of the vanished. The confrontation did not resolve the mystery. It only deepened it. The bodies of those killed in Sanità were buried quickly, without procession, without bells, without names on headstones. To the people, it was yet another attempt to erase, to deny, to vanish. And so the original disappearance of the December marchers was now doubled by the fresh disappearance of those who had dared to demand answers. Naples, once the city of processions, had become a city of silences. The year turned, and Naples staggered forward as if nothing had happened. The quarter of Sanità was cleared of barricades. The charred beams swept into piles, and soldiers stationed at crossroads to remind the city who still held power. Official proclamations spoke not of massacre but of restored order, the vanished procession of December, the raided palace of January, the clash of February. All were smoothed into silence by decree. To speak of them was to risk arrest. To publish them was treason. And so the story retreated underground, into whispers, into private journals, into sealed archives where dust would do the work of forgetting. Yet silence is never absolute. Fragments endured. A widow in the quarter kept the blood-stained handkerchief of her son, folded into a Bible where she prayed each night. A clerk in the municipal palace copied, by hand, a page from the extraordinary register, hiding it in the lining of his coat. And Dr. Verone, perhaps the most reluctant archivist of all, continued to write in his ledger, even as he feared discovery. His final entry, dated March 1838, reads, "The malady is not cholera alone. It is trust corroded, faith inverted, authority abused. The procession that vanished did not walk into heaven, nor into hell, but into the chasm that opens when a city devours itself." His handwriting trails, as if even the act of recording had become unbearable. Contrast defined the aftermath. By day, Naples presented itself as pious and orderly, its churches open, its markets busy, its officials stiff with ceremony. By night, the same city muttered of betrayal, of missing names, of coffers burned and letters stolen. Processions continued, but fewer walked in them, and those who did marched with hesitation, as if the road itself might swallow them. Faith remained, but it was fractured, turned inward, suspicious, brittle. What had once bound Naples together had now revealed the depth of its divisions. The Crown ordered the surviving documents locked away, stamped with seals, their covers marked Riservato. Decades later, researchers would stumble across vague references to the disturbances of 3738, but the details had been scrubbed. What could not be erased, however, was the memory carried by families, the missing, the dead, the unanswered. Naples learned to live with absence as one lives with an unhealed wound. And here, at the end of this account, the question shifts from Naples to us. What do we do with stories like this? Stories sealed in archives, whispered by survivors, too easily dismissed as rumor? Do we treat them as cautionary tales of mass hysteria, of institutions failing under pressure? Or do we recognize in them something far more enduring? The human need to walk together, even into danger. Because solitude feels like death? The people of Naples in 1837 believed their procession would deliver them. It delivered them instead into vanishing. Yet in their desperation, they revealed truths that still press upon us, that fear can bind as strongly as faith, that authority without transparency breeds suspicion, and that silence, when enforced, becomes its own kind of violence. As you listen now, nearly 2 centuries later, I invite you to consider not only their fate, but ours. In moments of crisis, where would you walk? Would you follow the torches of tradition, or the counsel of uncertain science? Would you demand documents and proof, even if they revealed more horror than comfort? Or would you, like so many in Naples, choose to march because to stand still was to die alone? This concludes our case. If this story unsettled you, I ask only that you carry it forward, not as morbid spectacle, but as a reflection on how fear, faith, and power shape the choices we all make. Share where you are listening from, and how you think you would have acted had you lived in Naples during those dark months. The vanished cannot answer us, but perhaps by asking ourselves, we may keep their memory from vanishing altogether.